Hello there, friends. This is Spencer Michelle, and today we're going to be talking about the new moon in the first decan of Scorpio, the new moon solar eclipse in the first decan of Scorpio. I am joined here today by my good friend Elodie Saint Ange Abou. This is Spencer Michelle, and does that sound? Did I get it correct? How did I do? In the first decan.
You did perfect.
Okay, good. I've been
Yeah.
practicing. I've been practicing.
Thanks for having me, and yeah, thanks for giving a try on my family name.
It's awesome. Yeah, my Venus in Gemini loves to be able to pronounce things correctly, and the name has power and energy, and so I always love being able to do that. And we have a pretty international crowd here too, so it's always nice to be able to like try to meet people, where they're at, So, LOD, tell our audience a little bit about yourself. You have a really interesting story. And I'm curious to hear more about how you came to astrology, some of the things that you've been up to, and sort of the really interesting lifestyle that you lead as well.
Well, astrology, I think, was always part of my experience, just being a teenager, into magical things and tarot and all of that. I think I probably met you also through Nightlight Astrology. I started studying with Adam in 2014. So I've been practicing professionally, for the last while. I live in Newfoundland, which is probably the part that is the most intriguing to people. I met somebody from here 20 years ago, and then we bought a cabin and I relocated here, learned to speak English because I did not speak English.
Wow.
And I always idolized self-sufficiency since, that was, as soon as I was a teenager, I was like, I want to live in a cabin in the woods, which seems to be the dreams of everybody now. But yeah, I really idolized the self-sustaining lifestyle like a lot of us, and pursued that in my early 20s and have been off grid for 20 years or so. So it's hard for me to conceptualize being dependent on the system, although I think we are all dependent on the system because we are interconnected. But yeah, I do value just being able to supply my own water, electricity, and things like that.
Yeah, I think you're living the 12th house sun dream,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
we have another friend of the show. Her name is Shu Yap. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She
No.
she's a 12th house sun who lives in Australia off the grid.
Okay.
And she's been living the 12th house dream a little bit as well. So I'm very envious with my 12th house Cancer sun of having that space, that self-sufficiency. I'm still kind of in a city a little bit here,
In
and
the business, yeah.
yeah, in the business exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's really fascinating, and I've been listening to some interviews that you've had recently, chatting about that off-grid lifestyle and how as a community and as a society we've been thrust into this on all the time type of experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I just before we even dive into any of the astrology, I would just like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on where we might be heading as a I don't know, human community, and how you've been dealing with those changes, and maybe some advice you might have for friends in our audience here.
That's a lot. That's a big tall order. In terms of, I do think that entering the air period, where we've entered the air period for the next
Right.
200 years. So I do think we might see a resurgence of like earth modalities that are more grounded as opposed to extractive. You know how we've just like extracted metals and produced things. So I do think maybe because of this influx of internet and busyness and communication, maybe it will push people more towards um, experiences of nature. And I do already see that. I don't think it's just Uranus and Taurus.
Yeah.
So I do think people are seeking ways to ground themselves as a balance to like this overwhelming busyness and fast pace of things. Because of artificial intelligence, I think our humanness and our body cannot keep up with the experience that we're having collectively,
Yeah.
with light, with being accessible all the time. I don't think it's necessarily just like a 12 house thing. I think like nature brings us back to a natural rhythm, and we're so far removed from that rhythm when we're interacting with being on all the time.
Yeah.
So I do think I'm hopeful for people returning to a less process way of eating, and hopefully, maybe I'm just idealistic, but I do think that that's going to happen. I see it. People are interested in getting back to eating unprocessed food, and just this awareness around nature and the
And
ecology.
you're a chef as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I was a cook for 20 years.
Yeah.
I cooked on remote bush camp location, so not like a restaurant chef, but
Sure.
yeah. So I worked for reforestation company. So we would go on clear cuts, set up camp. People would plant trees, and I would feed the tree planters. So I
Very
did
cool.
that for a long time. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of where we're heading, obviously, I do think there's something with artificial intelligence and the internet that is going to just accelerate things, and people are feeling very overwhelmed by that right now.
Yeah, we've got some shifts happening with Saturn's movement into Pisces and then Pluto moving into Aquarius simultaneously. I bet that's going to bring some interesting shifts at what next year around the spring.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to ask you though, living in Newfoundland, what's it like being able to see the sky unfiltered? I'm assuming there's a lot less light pollution there than in a place where I live, like in Michigan near Detroit.
Unfortunately, I live in the foggiest place
Oh,
in
no. Oh,
North
no.
America.
Oh no. Oh
Because
no.
the east coast of Newfoundland, which is the most easterly point of North America, we are really into the northern Atlantic Ocean,
Yeah.
and it's actually the foggiest and windiest place.
Wow. Okay.
So I did come to the end of the world completely exiled and in the fog, very much so. But I do have a Sun-Saturn conjunction.
Sure. Sure.
So yeah, I mean, the unfiltered, there's no light pollution per se, but it's cloudy here
Oh, that's a bummer.
very often.
Because I spent a little bit of time in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan a few years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
just being able to see so much more of the sky was such a visceral experience. You know, it was healing in a lot of ways, you know, being able to connect on that level. So,
Yeah,
but sometimes we have to live in those liminal spaces too, like the Caden houses are those
that's
liminal
right.
spaces, right? So,
Yeah.
okay.
I do live at a crossroad.
Me too. I do too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hecate is active at this location for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Elodie, I'm going to shout out a few of our friends that are joining us here. We've got Jody joining us from Southern Florida. Lynn is here from Vermont. Remco joining us from the Netherlands. Xteen is here from Florida. Tarja is stopping in from Finland. Dimfy is here from the Netherlands. Pearl is joining from Nova Scotia. Okay, so another
Maritimer.
Canadian. There you go. Excellent. And she's saying that they are saying that they just finished your lecture at Astro Magia. How was your
Okay.
experience there? How did that go?
I loved it. It was my second year. It's
Yeah.
a really well organized conference, and I think it's expanding. Yeah, JD does an excellent job at featuring like a lot of various practitioners. So it's not just like it's all astrological magic, but yeah, it's a very, very inclusive, very, very well organized conference. I
Very
do
cool.
like
What
participating.
was the topic that you spoke on?
I spoke, I've been researching lunar mansions for 3 years related to the Greek magical papyri. So, you know, that's just a compilation of papyri from the Greco Hellenistic time.
Right.
And there's a prayer to Mene, prayer to the moon, with a list of 28 animals.
Wow.
Which Jake Stratton Kent, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but he's an occultist from England.
Okay.
he made a connection that this list perhaps was linked to the 28 lunar mansion. So we started investigating, and yeah, so it's a big research project. We've lectured a lot. We have a website. So that's what we were talking about, basically.
Nice. And are,
Yeah.
are people able to access your talk after the fact?
Yeah, we will be posting it. We've only received the recording today, so we're posting it. That website is lunarzodiac.com, and
Okay.
we have previous lectures on sale there too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And do you have anything coming up in the hopper that you'd like to alert people to, or
I always do, but I'm a sneaky Scorpio.
Oh, okay. So you're Scorpio. Scorpio
I'm a Scorpio rising,
right? Yeah. And do you want to share your other big three with the audience here?
Yeah, so I'm Scorpio rising. I have Sun in Libra and Moon in Taurus.
Okay.
So deep down, I'm just vanilla. And I do have Mars rising, which kind of concentrate a lot of the energy on the rising. Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking. We share a lunar decan, right, with the moon in the second decan of Taurus, which I'm quite partial to that decan. It seems like a pretty nice energy, right?
Pretty sweet spot to be. Yeah,
I like it. Okay, so we can find you, Elodie, at where can we find you and your services?
So I have a website called themindhouse.com, I believe. I'm sure you will be putting the link.
Yeah.
But it also, if you just type my name, Elodie, with astrologer, a lot of information would come up, because I don't think there's,
And you do consults as well?
I do consults. I write horoscopes for Astrograph, monthly horoscopes, which is my main gig. And yeah, I do consulting, I do mentoring, and I do a lot of lecturing in separate events like this, but I'm very fluid in my approach. I think maybe with the moon and Taurus, but I do have like an organic approach. So I will do mostly what I feel like instead of keeping a rigid structure with my practice.
Oh, that's great. Flexibility is, I think, really important in this work when we create oracular space for people. And
exactly. Yeah.
And I'm, you and I actually, we go back a little bit. Like I think we originally met at the United Astrology Conference, and I didn't really realize it at the time how special that was, in the quote unquote before times, like sitting and breaking bread with some of the most, learned astrologers in the world. I mean, you and I, we had dinner with Austin Coppock and Nicholas. I'm trying to remember his last name, but I really
Polymenakos.
Yeah, he's really great.
Yeah.
And I believe Chris Brennan was at that dinner too, right?
Yeah.
Like you're sitting at a table with these people and you're like, wow, this is for me as a brand new astrologer at that point, a brand new, like, interested in pursuing it as a profession. That was just really quite an experience. So I hope that we're able to get back to that kind of experience a little bit as
we
move forward.
Yeah.
Okay, Elodie, I'm going to shout out a few more friends here that are stopping in. We've got another Tarja stopping in from Helsinki, Finland. We have Urania Universe. Portia is here. Welcome, Portia. Jules is joining us from Alberta. Cobabs is here. I believe that is Colette from Oregon. And then we have Natalia is joining from Jerusalem.
Wow.
Israel. Very cool.
Amazing.
I just love that we have such a nice international audience here. This is something that I really do hope to cultivate. And another friend joining us, X from Vancouver Island. I think we have a lot of Canadians in the chat often.
I just posted the link also on my page,
Nice.
so hopefully a few friends.
Yeah, my grandmother was actually born in London, Ontario, so I claim a little bit of Canadian in my background. I think it's cool. Okay, so just a few more business things before we dive in, Elodie. I just want to give people a heads up that I do have a sale on my Libra Decans webinar that I have posted in the store on my website. You can get 20% off of that recording until the end of Libra season, which is roughly around the 22nd. So you have about a week to save 20% on that, and keep your eyes peeled for a 20% off sale on the Scorpio Decans once Scorpio season begins. So that's really what I've got going on. I've been kind of doing an interesting book club with Demetra's book lately, her Ancient Astrology Volume 2, which is a really awesome book. There's I wanted to ask you if you dived into this text at all?
Demetrius text.
Yeah,
I tied my hands and kept myself from ordering this book because I already have such a big library to
sure.
move through.
Yeah,
And there's
yeah.
a Vitius Valens anthology that
Oh,
just came out, and I'm like, what am I gonna
yes.
do?
Right, right. I saw Chris Brennan posted that he did some, I believe, editing and or
Yeah.
forward in that book. Yeah, really cool. So that's a great heads up there, Elodie, is that there's a new edition of Vedius Valens that was translated by Mark. What is Mark's last name? Remind
I
me.
can't remember it. Starts with an R.
Yeah, Riley.
Believe.
That's Mark
Yes.
Riley, right? So Mark Riley had a translation of Valens that Chris Brennan used to really reference quite a bit. And now there's a version of it that you can buy that is like rebound and everything. Because before you'd have to get it like you'd have to print it off like a PDF or something
I
like
have
that.
it printed off and
Yeah,
bind it in a
exactly.
binder. Yeah.
So yeah, so check that out because Valens is one of the most complete traditional astrology texts that we have, and there's a lot of great nuggets in there, and it's great to support people like Chris as well. Okay, so that's what I've got going on for the business things. Friends, if you would like to support the work that we're doing here, the easiest thing you can do is hit the like button on this video to help with the algorithm. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do that, and also subscribe to the newsletter. If you'd like to make a material donation to the work that I do here, there's a little $ in the chat. It's called a super chat or a super sticker, and that helps me keep the lights on. If you're watching this after the fact, I also receive donations at buymeacoffee.com. Okay, Elodie, how about we dive into this eclipse here?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
So I wanted to ask, should we pull the chart up or should we get some big picture thoughts first? What do you think?
There's a lot to it. We can probably warm up with big picture thought, I
Yeah.
think, because there's a lot of layers.
Yeah, what do you think? What are you seeing as far as if you're pulling back from your 30,000-foot viewpoint?
Well, eclipses come in cycles. So first of all, this cycle, began a little while back. So it's not an eclipse or, eclipse come in pairs, first of all, and they also come in a 1.5-year cycle. So we have to take that in consideration as a sort of process or context that we find ourselves in on the Scorpio-Taurus axis. And although we're going to be talking about Scorpio and Scorpio season and Scorpio eclipse, I do think that the polarity, Scorpio-Taurus axis is really important in considering eclipses, because we have the north and south node and they work together, not really in isolation, even in natal chart also.
Right.
So it's always a process of, I see the north node and south node where the eclipses happen as a sort of battery.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
How do you see this is something that I've always had a lot of musings on. How do you see a new moon eclipse that is conjoining the south node? Like a place where it would seem with the south node or K2 being a place potentially of decrease, but yet we have this initiating energy of a new moon. How do you reconcile that question in particular?
I don't say that I reconciled it so much as I do a case by case depending on the chart, depending on the moment. So looking at what is happening again, like the planet that rules that eclipse per se and all of that. Because we're talking about south node, but we're already through a process with Scorpio south node. It has been there already for what is it, since like last November, a little bit before. So this process has already started, and I think the purgative, can you say that in English? Purgative?
Sure.
Purgation,
Yeah.
like the cleansing process of the south node, because the south node is associated with the process of spiritualization or saturation. I think that's already started a while back, and I'm starting to see the more positive manifestation of what the south node can do.
Yeah. So like a purgative, would you say as well?
Purgative, that's the word I was looking for. Purgative. And the Vedic astrologer actually consider K2 as, or maybe sometimes even more important than the Rahu, the North Node,
Right.
because it takes us away from the world of illusion, the samsara, the material reality, and shows us the inner working behind everything. So there's always a spiritual insight on that end.
Right. I've been feeling like this eclipse. It reminds me of like the beginning of an ending, like a ritualized mourning or a period of grief type
I
of
love that.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I wonder, I love the fact that we're bringing in the spiritualization of the South Node, because a lot of times I think when I've seen with clients and whatnot is that when we have some South Node stuff, we tend to material reality tends to leave
Yeah,
the plane of existence, and that we've been trained in late stage capitalism that that's a really bad thing.
yeah,
You know,
exactly.
so I think that it's really fascinating to hear the Vedic perspective on it, where they actually are more interested in escaping that material reality by releasing that attachment to physical
Yes.
reality. So that to me is a really powerful part of this eclipse, big picture wise. Um, for those of you who don't know the Rahu Ketu story, and feel free to add this as well. Like, Ketu was a demon, the severed head of a demon, right? That was trying to consume the elixir of immortality, right? And because that was kind of a no-no, like there was another deity that kind of severed his head, and then there's kind of this hungry ghost that it never is able to be satiated on some level potentially. Whereas Rahu is the body that is processing, sort of like I don't know, if we want to be crass about it, it's kind of like a shitting dragon that's like, all right, I'm gonna like shit all this crap out, like on some level. Do you have any other thoughts about how those two interact with one another and your
Yeah.
understanding of it?
Yeah. So like from a person, when I deal with eclipses delineation, if I'm dealing with a client, I always look at their personal relationship in their natal chart with the nodes. And that's going to give you a lot of information as to how things might translate for you, how you're going to experience the eclipse. Just your personal sort of relationship with Rahu and Ketu. I do think they work together. But the head is often, Rahu, the head of the dragon, the North Node, is often delineated as a little bit of like an insane kind of hunger that is neurotic almost. It's compulsive. And I always use the word compelling. I'm compelled to do this. I feel compelled to do this. We're compelled to participate in material reality, and we're compelled by our desires. And that's all the realm of Rahu. But not getting what we want is also what, not like Saturn so much, but a little bit similar in a sense. It's what refines us and refines our desires. So, there's like an interplay between desire and not having what you want being sort of the silver lining and the clarification process that we need to really actually get into more authentic expression of what we want. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah.
And there's a word in there that I'm kind of grabbing onto here. Desire. I think that was something that really came up in research around the first decan of Scorpio, and maybe even a difficulty having those desires fulfilled, right? In Austin's book, he talks about a daimon or spirit with this decan, the nymphi, those objects of desire. And there's just some really interesting literature about the Pleiades, and they're like being chased by Orion, and then like the Scorpion is part of that story, where the Scorpion was sent by Artemis to basically kill Orion because he, was boasting about destroying all of her wonderful creatures on some level, right? So I think that's another kind of thing I've been kind of grabbing onto with this eclipse, is that there may be something that we want that may be difficult getting fulfilled, or having an awareness of our desires and our things that eventually we may find aren't necessarily the most healthy for us. My experience, and I want to get your feedback on this. My experience of Scorpio, especially in the northern hemisphere, is that it's because it's Mars ruled. To me, Mars is the the defender of the instinctual defender of life force, right?
Yep. Well
And
said.
so if we have Mars as a severing and separating energy, in Aries, it's severing and separating from the collective to be infused into a body, maybe as the transition goes from Aries to Taurus. In Scorpio, to me, I think it's the opposite. We're severing from the body to liberate some kind of spiritual essence to be infused into kind of some new sense of purpose potentially as we move forward. Has that been your experience of living Scorpio? And what types of experiences have shaped your character around that particular experience potentially?
Yeah, that's interesting comparing the Mars placement. I do think obviously the sign of Scorpio is informed by its ruler, Mars, because it's the night ruler. We're talking about things that are not visible, you know?
Yeah.
And often desire and our desires, I think, are very profound and they actually have a lot to say, but we try to rationalize
Right.
our experience and rationalize our desires. I always say there's something very unconscious about Scorpio placement. Although if you look at the delineation in pop astrology, they will say Scorpio understands everything. It's like an X-ray vision. It can understand the psychology of people very easily, or of the psychology of a room and the dynamic. There's something about the own motivation of Scorpio, and that's what I notice in general, that is so profoundly visceral and intuitive that it's not accessible with our rational mind.
Yeah.
It's in the realm of the visceral. I sometimes compare Mars to the root chakra, or survival instinct, and our
Yes.
survival instinct has its own agenda outside of what you're trying to do in society.
Yeah. It's not always conscious, is it?
It's not.
Yeah,
And
that's go ahead.
yeah, it will be in retrospect often with the Scorpio energy that you'll be like, oh, this is why that happened. This is why I was acting like that. This is why I did that.
Right.
There's a real understanding of psychology, but I do find that in the moment, the guiding principle, the impulse, the pulsion, the desire that really informs are really obscured to there's its own rational, which isn't more of an animalistic.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I mean, that's something I think to be aware of with this eclipse is that, it is probably tapping into our deepest survival instincts on some level, where we may not even be completely aware of what narrative is functioning behind the surface of our
Mhm.
emotions, of our actions, of our feelings. And I think that that's something that really came up with Mars research that I've been doing. Because think about it like this: we've got Mars as part of the lunar sect, right? It is part of that instinctual realm of Tukey, of fortune, that is operating below the surface rather than in the light of awareness that would maybe be associated with the solar sect, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And I just want to mention also that there's
Yeah.
something about defensiveness with the Mars and Scorpio is more about protection and defensiveness. So I do think that because it is such an all-consuming sort of realm, the realm of your viscera,
Yeah.
the realm of your real, I don't know, like your animal self, that it's very protected and guarded. So I think that's one of the other reasons why it's not easily accessible.
Sure. Yeah, I like the thought process around it being defensive rather than maybe a proactive
Offensive.
Mars. Yeah,
Yeah.
because that Aries Mars seems to be like, I would love to go and conquer something, right? It is very active and yang,
Yeah.
but Scorpio definitely seems like it's like, all right, I'm just gonna be lurking in the shadows, but if you mess with me, like, that's when it's on, right?
It's the relationship to
Yeah,
power.
yeah,
Mars is our relationship to power. And I always say that there's Mars issues in our society because we are not in relation with our power. A lot of
right.
people are not in relationship with their power. We don't
Yeah,
have the catharsis. We need catharsis and we need experience that really brings us back into a sort of clear channel but because we're constantly building on superficial layer,
Mm.
I find a lot of people have issues with Mars, either sexuality or expressing anger or confrontation or being direct.
Right, right. Well, and we're not getting any help from Mars right now in the
No.
sign of Gemini. Like, right? Directness is not super supported with this particular Mars. Let's pull the chart up here and start
Yeah.
breaking this down. Really enjoying your thoughts here, Elodie. I was excited to have you on as a guest. I always have thought you were a very intelligent and well-read astrologer and someone who has really done good work over the last few years here.
Thank you.
Hold on a second. Speaking of Mars defending, we are just doing a little bit of housekeeping here. Okay, so Elodie, I've got up on the chart here. Sorry, I had your chart up here too. So now, like,
the moon is in Leo right now.
Right, there it goes. That was not intentional. I'm sorry about that. So sorry, we're getting spammed a little bit here in the chat. And since this is a safe space, we don't allow that type of thing here. Holy cow. So maybe this is our little scorpionic, in action.
Are we under attack?
I think so. I think we might be a little bit. Holy cow.
That's the thing though, with Mars, we're always under attack.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think we are. So I think that we've gotten that. Hopefully that is purified our channel a little bit. Yeah. Okay. So let's refocus here. Sorry, friends. We're just dealing with a little housekeeping here. So we're looking at October the 25th, 2022, 6:48 a.m. Eastern time. I learned for the first time this week that Newfoundland has a half-hour difference. Like,
that's right.
Oh my goodness, that's as if it wasn't challenging enough. But that's cool.
Yeah.
So this would be, oh my God, math is troubling. So this would be somewhere around
8:10, I think.
8:10 Newfoundland time.
That's right.
Here. So let's we'll make that adjustment. We've got the moon and the sun coming together at about 2 degrees of Scorpio, and we have the south node at 13 degrees. We are looking at Venus also playing a part in this eclipse, having just recently been Cazimi at 29 degrees of Libra, about a day or so, a couple days earlier than that, and then moving into Scorpio. And Mars is hosting. Now, this is, to me, this is one of the more interesting parts of this, is that we've got Mars in Gemini, in the third decan of Gemini, hosting this eclipse, but it's in aversion. So what do you think about Mars as host, Venus as playing, what role Venus is playing, and how those two things are going to be playing out?
Very difficult to synthesize. I do think that Mars in Gemini has been very scattering, if only because there is so many potential avenues. It's really hard to, I have found the astrology of late October and the fall very hard to synthesize, because I do think there's a lot of different threads going on. And it's part of a larger context, which is, I think, Pluto leaving Capricorn, the end of cycles, and really us entering the air period. I do think there's kind of like this primer. I think Mars and Gemini maybe serving as primer for this influx of air. And I actually really like what Mars has been doing in conversation with Libra and Saturn in the last month. But in terms of, how it serves the Scorpio eclipse, because it rules it,
Right.
yeah, it's again, when we're talking about the realm of visceral, it's not straightforward. It's like there is compulsion to release certain desire or release certain Venusian. I involve Venus in this solar eclipse because Venus is a big part of it. So
Yeah.
there's something about desire and purging old ways of being.
Yes.
But
Yes.
Mars is complexifying that process, I do think.
Yeah. I think that I agree that Venus is, first of all, I mean, Venus is not super comfortable in Scorpio. So we will put that out there, Venus being in her exile. And my experience of Venus in a house of Mars is that generally Venus, in my experience, functions well when we are receptive and we let things come to us. And when we have Venus in a Martial house, it seems like we may create problems for ourselves through the pursuit of something rather than allowing it to come to us. Would you say that that is a
I love
correct?
that
Yeah.
perspective. I do think it's, yeah, again, Venus and Scorpio is a very complex placement, and we always have to be careful when speaking of planets in detriment or fall as
Yeah.
astrologers, because it just describes a condition. It does not necessarily describe if it's good or bad.
Definitely.
Um, and the Venus and Scorpio people that I know, or how it shows, there's actually the Venus principle is there, but I do like what you're pointing out. It's true that there might be something more about the pursuit instead of the receptivity.
Right. And if we look at Mars and what it's pursuing, to me, Gemini is that place where we're expanding options, where it is proliferation of
Yes.
options. It's that bee that's pollinating all of the different flowers. And but to me, I think Mars's role in Gemini is maybe potentially eliminating some of those imagined pathways,
Mm.
right? Saying, well, we can kind of get some we can explore a little bit, but eventually to make a choice. I'm reminded of that Castor and Pollux myth where one of the twins has to give up some of his immortality to be able to share, Olympus with his brother. And to me, that requires sacrifice, right? There's some kind of sacrifice involved with that. I've been counseling folks. This is something that came up in both T. Susan Chang's work, 36 Secrets, and Austin Coppock's 36 Faces, is they both talk about the third decan of Gemini being a place where, because it's a solar decan, where the choices become very contrasted. Like there's sort of a black and white energy where you might want to Austin calls it the executioner's sword. So it's kind of this energy where you may make an ultimatum or some kind of choice that doesn't necessarily allow for ambiguity. And I've been kind of counseling people maybe to hold off on that.
Yep.
Right? Because Mars is going to be stationing retrograde a few days after this eclipse. And if you do make some kind of ultimatum, you might find that you have to backtrack on it, and that could cause a lot more problems or embarrassment or humbling.
I
Um,
agree with you.
yeah, right? Is that that's coming up for
Absolutely.
you?
I think you're right on. And this ambiguity, that's what I appreciate about the air influx that we had at the beginning of September. But I did find that a lot of people, a lot of clients, a lot of friends around me are not able to sit with that ambiguity of
Right.
not being able to choose. There's many options, and it's not necessarily about making a choice right now, although Mars is looking for that direction.
Right. Right.
We're looking for that clear channel, but it's not, it's more complex than that. And I like that.
I feel like a silver lining to this too would be I think Mars's role is potentially in eliminating distractions on some level. I feel like sometimes Gemini can be a place where we can fall prey to distraction. And I know for me personally, I've had lots of different distractions that have come up in the past few weeks with Mars and Gemini. And it takes a lot of like real action and discipline to say, well, I'm not going to worry about that right now. And we're heading into, oh boy, we're heading into election season in the United States, and that's the ultimate like distraction as far as, the volume of rhetoric
Information,
and
yeah.
information, rhetoric, people using words as weapons is something that I think that we're seeing increasing around this period of time. And to me, that's very stressful. But I want to tell me, Elodie, tell me how we can utilize this energy in a healthy way. How can we utilize what Mars is asking us to do in a way that can be supportive of our nervous system rather than a detriment to it?
I think you said it perfectly. I think eliminating distraction is exactly on point. I've been
Yeah.
doing that intuitively, because we see Mars stationing retrograde around that eclipse, and it's also in a square with Neptune applying, which already
Right.
happened once. And I do associate Neptune with the media very
Yeah.
often, and Mars in this like mercurial sign. So we can see that, and we are constantly plugged in.
Yeah.
So eliminating distraction is probably one of the best possible ways of navigating the next few months. I do think that's right on, especially as we are trying with the Scorpio eclipse. It's bringing a sort of purging process, refining process in terms of desires. But how do you do that if you're pulled in like 100 million direction?
Yeah. Yeah. Just a practical example of this. I have a 140-year-old house that we recently purchased earlier this year, and it's connected with these eclipses, right? We
Yeah.
purchased it around the eclipse, and we're dealing with some challenges trying to maintain it. And there's an attic and a basement that's full of junk that needs to be purged. And we've just had a real, I guess, a devil of a time, like trying to actually find the time to do it.
Yeah.
Saying like we want to purge, but everything is pulling us in a million different directions. And actually having the necessary presence to do that has been, it's felt like an uphill climb on some level, right?
Yeah, and again, I do think in the end that Mars is doing the Saturn and Aquarius agenda. So I do think this whole process that we're moving through eventually will be a refining process. But when we're looking at the Scorpio Taurus angle, they're really embodied and felt axis,
Yeah.
So in terms of like wanting to get stuff done, wanting to clear your house, and then having to sit with the ambiguity of being surrounded with stuff and not being able to move or be efficient with that,
Yeah.
is about becoming present again in your experience, as opposed to like just on the goal or something. And I think I naturally kind of have been reinstating every day. I'm focusing on what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm literally, it's a mindfulness exercise. And the better you are at mindfulness and at returning to the present and your actual reality and not 3 steps down, the better you will be at juggling, because it's a juggling act for most people right now. They're juggling a lot of in different parts of reality that do not necessarily synthesize together or come together.
Absolutely. And I'll say that Mars is doing a number on my Virgo stellium. I have a Virgo stellium, and it's like the efficiency question has been very, very challenging. I will say in regards to that, I always pull a tarot card of the day, and today I got the Four of Swords, which I think
Oh,
is a great energy that is complementary to what we're speaking to around Mars. Is being able to collect our thoughts and be able to maybe through the process of meditation quiet the mind. I had a really difficult day yesterday with just a lot of, there was some things in our community actually that was going around that was a little disturbing. There's some I don't know, I'm not going to even touch on it here, but there was some folks in the astrological community that had been acting out of integrity, and it's frustrating when you see that, especially because it's difficult enough to have people respect the work that we do, and when there are certain folks out there that are using it for their own profiteering and advantage. It's very frustrating as an astrologer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on in all walks of life, I think, but especially if you're
Absolutely.
investing time and energy on the internet, you have to be
Right.
ready to just have it
Yeah, yeah. So
stolen.
well, and I was nice to get that message from the cards to be like, quiet your mind down. You don't have to figure all this out all the time, and like I think that's good advice with this Mars too. So Elodie, coming back to the tarot, I wanted to talk a little bit about the tarot syncretization that we have with this eclipse. And here we see the Five of Cups, and I'm actually gonna stop my share for a minute because I'd like people to be able to see this. So this is a card where we see a figure who is cloaked in black. They have their head down in a pose that could be so maybe described as mourning or grief. There are three spilled cups in front and two upright cups behind. Um, what is your experience of this card, this energy? What is the message that you're getting from this particular card in the tarot in this decan?
That's a good question. I don't work with the tarot that much. Um, and I'm also a very cynical person, I think, because of this situation
Sure.
that just keeps happening.
Yeah.
There's definitely something about grief or loss in terms of like not getting what you want that is a close experience to me. I don't know that's so much just Scorpionic as like also being Saturn ruled,
Sure.
but I was talking with another Scorpio rising friend, and we were talking about things that appease us, that
Hmm.
helps us make decisions.
Yeah.
And we both always say, if I die tomorrow, what is it that I would do right now? There's this real awareness of like the precarity of things.
Sure. Sure. Kind of raging against the dying of the light on some level, right?
But not even raging. It's
Yeah,
just kind of a lucidity, I would say.
yeah, an awareness of the impending winter, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, in the sequence of the zodiac, yeah, there's something about loss that is just kind of inherent, but it's very integrated, I think, in Scorpio. And that's why we get the pop astrology meme of like Scorpio being goth or whatever, you
Sure,
know?
sure. Yeah, I mean this is pointing out to me that this eclipse may be associated with a ritualized grief or a ritualized mourning potentially. I've been having thoughts and intuitions with this card that maybe we will be going through some collective grief or some collective mourning potentially. Um, I always think about this card as making sure that we take the time to acknowledge what we've lost. I think this is something that I've heard our teacher Adam talk about is oftentimes we want to whitewash, something that's difficult or our feelings of loss and move on to the transformative experience. And I think sometimes it's okay to sit with the feelings of grief and to acknowledge them, to have a good cathartic cry, to have like an ugly cry, or to have like a just something where you're actually allowing yourself to feel that sense of loss on some level. So think about it in that regard. I think that the other message I usually give with this decan is that there is something about loss that can help us to feel gratitude for the things that remain on some level. Um, as a Scorpio rising, has your experience of loss helped you experience that its opposite with gratitude in that level?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. And I think that's a mode for me for sure. I'm just in that mode absolutely at every, it's very rare that I'm uh it might be more complex than that, but it's very rare that I'm not I want to be in full potential. There's something about being in full potential, and that's also involves being in the full experience of the negative, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
A lot of people
absolutely.
are really afraid of going into the more intense negative emotions with others, or even just like acknowledging. And I do think Scorpio really actually, it's kind of their expertise, you know,
Yeah.
to be going straight for the most yeah, truth, and the truth about, yeah, how things that can be difficult.
Have you found my experience with my Scorpio friends, rising sun, moon, otherwise, is that they happen to be some of the most reliable folks when a crisis hits. Have
Yeah,
you found yourself playing that role for either in your own life or for people in your life, being sort of almost like a crisis manager?
I see crisis.
Okay, okay.
I'm
Right.
just gonna be very honest.
Yeah,
I do see crisis, and it's a very unconscious thing. But I'm saying that in like the best possible way.
sure.
Because there's something, again, very visceral about intensity and stuff, and because I have a moon in Taurus, I can see that part of myself more clearly, because I do value stability and peace and groundedness also.
Right.
But for example, I was cooking on bush camps, very isolated, dealing with grizzly bears in my kitchen, breaking in, you know,
Wow.
sleeping in my tent, because the whole season of cooking would be, you know, in the woods, very isolated.
Right.
And I would hear like rumorage during the night, and I would know it's the bears. And if nobody, like, if I don't deal with my kitchen, nobody will. So just this experience of real yeah, these, I do think there's something about just meeting intensity head on. There's something very potent about that, and that's again Mars and power and feeling your power. And really feeling your power is being in survival mode.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
there's something about, you know, when I say seeking crisis or intensity, where there's this need to live really everything like just a little threshold a little bit higher.
Yeah. So if we have some heightened emotional feelings, how do you stay grounded during those periods of crisis when you're seeking them out? How do you stay centered while you're going through those challenges?
Well, nature for me helps a lot. I do
Yeah.
think nature, but I do think also uh accepting the experience. So I don't know necessarily that I stay grounded actually.
Yeah.
And that's something that is scary for a lot of people, this sort of just like being fully in the experience. That's why I was saying, again, people have Mars issues, not wanting to be in anger or not wanting to be completely in the experience. So in terms of staying grounded with intense experience, again, is an exercise in mindfulness. It's about being present with the experience, not trying to stop the experience.
Yeah. Presence, I think, is a good, definitely. It's a good, as
Am I
as,
scaring you?
as I'm getting distracted by the all the challenges going on in the chat here. I'm like, oh,
Okay.
I'm practicing presence. I wanted to reach out to all of you in the chat and thank you for all these wonderful comments. You all have so many wonderful thoughts and contributions here. I'm sorry I'm not getting to everything here today. We're just, Elodie and I are just diving into the depths of the scorpionic waters. I did want to shout out Rachel. Thank you so much for your donation. I really appreciate that. And thank you all of you for being here today and your patience with the chat too. We're just having some, we're having to defend the chat against the modern equivalent of a dragon, I guess, in a spammer. So,
Perfectly Mars and Gemini also demonstration.
right,
Like
totally.
the trickster attack.
Yeah. So Elodie, we're going to have Mars stationing retrograde on the 30th of October, and that's going to be stationing retrograde until about the 12th of January and turning direct at about 8 degrees of Gemini. There's another condition that I'm curious if you have thoughts on or experience with, and it's that Mars is going to be moving out of bounds at a similar period of time for, let me checks his notes here, for 7 months. Like,
Woo!
what do you think about that? Out of bounds being Mars when it is outside of the normal declination path of the sun.
Whew. Well, I do think in general, and I mean, the opposite might be true, but I do think in general, Mars retrograde actually accentuates the Mars a lot more. People get impatient, irritated, wanting to, and I do think the out of bound just adds like a very uh hard to predict element.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of astrologers having a hard time actually delineating, because there is such ambiguous already an ambiguity with Gemini. It's two side. It's this and it's opposite.
Yeah, it's a spicy Mars, and I feel like it's a wild card, right?
Exactly. Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, where it's something where Mars is not performing under the social expectations that we normally, the boundaries that normally keep it quote unquote in line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that could lead to some really really difficult experiences, especially with our communication. um, I guess my advice on that would be think twice before speaking, and because I think that there may be something. I experience the planets as these and this is by no means some huge original thought, but it's like these they're influences. I feel like, oh well, I'm influenced by this, and sometimes I can use the power of my choice and awareness and clarity to make a different choice in the moment. Sometimes it's just fated and we're just going to go deal with it. But I think if there is any pronoia or forethought, um, maybe try to, the value of astrology is being able to think in the moment, hey, wow, maybe I should consider the ramifications of my words or my communications potentially before, and how that might create conflict or challenges that would be very hard to come back from. I think I'll, hammer the point home that I think it's really important not to make all or nothing ultimatums and threats. I think threats are a really bad thing to make around this period of time, because Mars is going to be making, extra juice behind it potentially, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree. And I always, when I started learning more about my own birth chart and really getting into the fact that I have Mars with my ascendant and, framing my experience through Mars, and the more I progress with my knowledge of astrology, the more my relationship to the present and Mars and difficulty is very martial, in the sense that it's like, I imagine myself always in combat to a certain extent with reality. And there is the piece of the warrior, how they say like a real martial artist will never have to actually act.
Right.
So what you're saying about like thinking twice or whatever, basically how I approach, seeing these transits too, people have to exist, like things happen. Right. It's not, we can't control things outside of ourselves. So even if you're aware of the astrology and, putting yourself on a, time out or something, people are still coming at you, circumstances are still going to come at you, and you still have to contend with the experience. Right. But again, there's something about flexibility and being present with the moment, in a sense, so that you can best possibly meet what is being presented. And there's so much of that right now because of the scattering influence of Gemini, and just like how you have to deal with the chat right now as we're talking, and you're maneuvering a lot of different things. But this is what Mars and Gemini has been doing to everybody on a lot of fronts. Like this morning my internet was not working, so I went somewhere else. The internet was not working. I knew that I had to meet with you, and I was just like, stay cool, it's gonna happen, be in the flow. And that's the mutable too. Just like the more you're trusting the flow and the experience, the more you can synchronize with it. And then the more you resist it, the more you procrastinate or become flustered and anxious and scattered. So
I really appreciate your resilience today, because these are great thoughts that you're sharing with our community here, and I'm so grateful that you were able to take the next step when you were presented with the challenge. And that to me is, I think, a great example of the types of experiences that we may be faced with around this period of time is how can we pivot when the first thing doesn't work? How can we move forward into trying to find a solution that can make the best possible outcome? Okay, so I'm looking at the chat here, and thank you. My good friend from the Netherlands is helping me moderate now, so we've got some
Two
eyes.
swords.
We've got
Two swords.
we've got some eyes on it now, so that's good. Our good friend Janet Goodspeed is here too, a wonderful maker of talismanic jewelry, saying that I watched Elodie's Astromagia talk last night on the 28 shapes, and it was so cool. Glad I can catch her here today on my favorite channel. Well, thank you,
Nice.
Janet. And I'm glad that you were able to catch Elodie's talk as well. June is joining us from Maui as well, which is very cool. Thank you for all of you that are joining us today. Welcome, Kate and Water Trine Muse and Stephen the Jupiterian. It's always fun to see folks out there in the audience. Okay, so Elodie, we've talked about the eclipse. We've talked about Mars and Gemini, the third decan of Gemini, which maybe is the last decan, right before the solstice, the summer solstice, where we have a change of direction. And to me, I see all of those last decans before the solstice as some kind of sacrifice that we need to make, right? We've got like the 10 of Wands last decan before the winter solstice, as we're trying to carry all the bundle of sticks to the finish line so we can get to the point where the sun will rise in the sky again and the light will return. When we are looking at the rest of our astrological part here, let me think. I'm looking down my list here. Anything else that's coming to you about this eclipse that you think that our group here should know?
Well, like I was saying earlier, the fact that Venus is involved in this eclipse, so it's a new moon in Scorpio, conjoined with Venus, but being a solar eclipse, so there is a strong relationship to Venus with this moment in time, which Venus relates to self-worth, values, what we're attracted to, the kind of relationship we want. So I do think there's this whole purging process of old ways of being with that Venus, because she's just finishing an important cycle. There's the whole cycle of Venus that's involved with this eclipse. So it makes it very relational or desire-based, even more so because of the involvement with Venus.
Right.
But it's like, in order to get with the program of your new desires or your new relationship to yourself, to your sense of self-worth, to money, you're going to need to deal with what Mars and Gemini is bringing, which means you're going to need to deal with your to-do list and a lot of things before you can get to that kind of next chapter.
Absolutely.
And Jupiter, interestingly, is sitting on the 0. Like, that's a very important place for Jupiter to be, I think. Also indicative of something that might kind of resolves itself in the spring. That's how I've been reading it.
Okay.
Because it's at the 0 equinox point, the beginning of the zodiac. It's a very pivotal place for Jupiter, and Jupiter is retrograding. Mars, which ruled that Jupiter is stationing retrograde. So we can see that once these planets starts moving again, it brings us to mid-March.
Right.
So in terms of time frame, that's how I frame it for myself,
So the events that we're experiencing at this particular eclipse, you feel are going to be connected with that time period in mid-March, and might take that time to
play out. That's, instead of being hard on yourself and feeling inefficient, because I think Mars retrograde in Gemini and even this moment in time is making people feel things are going very fast. I can't keep up. What can I do? How can I adjust? And there's this feeling of maybe not being efficient enough, but giving yourself permission to see a longer time period to accomplish like all of your goals that you're setting out to do, instead of pressuring you to doing it all like before the end of the year or something,
I love that. Yeah, because I think that one of the things that I've often felt in living in, North America is that we have a real difficulty um, slowing down at this time of the year when our bodies, the amount of light, the darkness is asking us to kind of go internal and to slow down and not necessarily have to be quote unquote as productive as, society wants us to be. And that's always been a real challenge and a disconnect for me. And I like that you're telling folks that, hey, maybe we don't have to get every single thing accomplished, quote unquote, before the spring, right? Because it's supposed to be a period of rest, right?
Yeah, and just looking at the astrology, that's the way it makes sense to me. That's how I've framed my sort of personal timeline in terms of what I'm wanting to accomplish, because there is a lot of unknown factor coming at me,
Yeah.
because there is a lot of still obstruction. The process of Saturn in Aquarius is on its finishing. Saturn's going to be entering Pisces at the same time. So it seems to be sort of like we're finishing things, we're tying up loose end. We want to initiate a lot of new things that I think is symbolized by Venus, disappearing at the end of a cycle, burning off, being eclipsed, all of this sort of release of like old ways of being or old desires or old value system and all of that. But it's not instantaneous. And we have this real experience of instantaneous because of the internet. We're just plugging in. It's always happening. Everybody's successful online. Everybody's always on vacation. Everybody's always hustling. There's always money to be made. So there's this impression that as soon as you're connecting with the internet realm and people and all the online experience, that it's just like always happening. So it makes you feel a lot more inefficient as a human.
I agree. I think it's very difficult to unplug with the way that we have our reliance on the internet and those tools. And it is, I heard you chatting with Cassandra Tyndall about this a few weeks ago, potentially, how it's maybe even reshaping the species on some level, right? The evolution of the species, right?
Yeah, that was Irliana in Florida podcast. Yeah, that I did a little while ago. But our eyes are seeing light when we're looking. Our body, when we look at our screen, our body just think it's daytime.
Yeah.
And even though we know that we shouldn't be bringing screen to bed, or we should wait an hour before bed and like to unplug and stuff, the compulsion is very strong. And we're a social creature, and we have we actually have communities online of people. It fulfills something for us, and the platforms are engineered to keep us on. So it's not just like all bad, but I think, it's a turning point for humans in terms of like our whole physiology, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that what I was hearing when you were speaking earlier too is that we're having a lot of difficulty with the concept of delayed gratification, right?
Yeah.
Right. This was something that my Taurus rising dad taught me. He just hammered that point home, delayed gratification. And I think that we, in our instantaneous world that we have, in our instant gratification society that we're moving towards, that concept, which by the way, I think is part of nature. It's the internet is sort of unnatural on some level, isn't it? Like, and how do we make adjustments to that when we are creatures of nature, and we're faced with this very unnatural new organism in our consciousness? I do feel like it is an organism on some level. It has its own life. It has its own growth, and I'm not sure it's a good organism. I mean, there's some good.
I'm gonna say, but there's something parallel happening with our interconnectedness. And that's how, again, just bringing a silver lining or a different sort of, perspective, is that we're all interrelated. Right. Nature is all interrelated. If you start thinking about particles and matter, really, there's nothing that separates us. And I do think that internet is mirroring this, and instance of synchronicity or telepathy and stuff like that is happening a lot more between people. because of this instant, we're able to message each other across the globe at any moment. So, if I have a dream about you, I can text you in the morning and be like, hey, I dreamt about you. You were doing this and this. And then you're like,
Right.
oh, that's weird. That's what I'm doing. We have this instant feedback with each other that allows us to actually see the inherent connectedness that we have.
Yes.
And that might be too far out, but I do think like humans used, remote viewing, telepathy, and different modes of connecting with each other before for hunting, for
Sure.
situating where maybe other people were in the landscape. We're doing that with the internet to a certain extent, and that's how I like to see it. I like to just imagine it as this sort of interconnectedness of which is inherent between all of us.
It's an externalization of that.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess if I backtrack a little bit off of my previous statement, the internet is a tool, and right, tools can be, they are, neutral potentially, right? Like a knife can be used to cook food,
Yeah.
and it can be used to kill someone or hurt someone. So I think that, how do we learn responsible use of the tools that we have? Because there are some beautiful things about the internet. Look at what we're doing here today. We're connecting over thousands of miles with people all over the globe. So, and that should be acknowledged too. And I guess we get to choose how we both consume this, I don't know, I guess I hate the word content, but how we consume or utilize our time on the internet as a tool, what we put into it, and what we take out of it, right? And I think that, again, I think it comes back to having healthy boundaries, doesn't it? Isn't this what Saturn is trying to tell us? Because here's what one other thing I wanted to kind of look at in this chart is we have this sort of giving over of Saturn and its retrograde to Mars retrograde here. So Saturn, it has not been has been moving backwards, and now it turns direct on the 23rd, and then a few days later Mars takes over and goes retrograde. My experience of Saturn retrograde, and I'd love to hear your experience too, is that our boundaries are become a little bit more permeable when Saturn is retrograde, and the previous, like, maybe maturations or limits or boundaries don't necessarily function as well when Saturn is retrograde. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I was very thankful for Saturn retrograde because it's been on my case.
Okay.
So the retrograde, yeah, absolutely. I felt like it was like, whew, pressure up. As most astrologer, I love Saturn and I love the process of Saturn because it's always clarifying. So the retrograde kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off. And I do think that when it stations direct again, all the work that has been needed in terms of boundaries kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
But it was already there. We're already in this process. Like, Saturn has been squaring and opposing everything in my chart. And at the beginning, it felt very, very constricting.
Yeah.
And now it feels liberating because I'm transcending these issues,
Yeah.
So, yeah. So Saturn, I mean.
And we've had this Saturn grinding in this square between Uranus and Saturn for a few years now.
Yeah.
And we almost had another one perfect, but then I believe that there's a traditional technique called reformation, where one of the planets turns around and the aspect doesn't perfect. So I think that there's this tension we've been feeling between limits, boundaries, tradition, and shaking up our routines and our how we utilize our resources. And this might be, hopefully, maybe this tension starts to abate a little bit as we move forward throughout these next months. The other thing I was looking at here too, Elodie, is that around the same time that Mars is retrograding, Jupiter is backtracking back into Pisces. How do you see that playing out in the narrative of our eclipse season?
So Jupiter was here just before the beginning of eclipse season this spring.
Hmm.
So I do think it ties in a lot of things that were germinating at the beginning of the year that seemed promising but didn't fertilize or didn't come through
Hmm.
yet. I do think at the end of the year could bring sort of a unfolding of the promises that Jupiter may have, shimmered, because the eclipse in Taurus that happened in May, I don't know if you remember, but it was really juiced up with Jupiter, Neptune, Venus. We were looking at this as astrologer being like, oh my God, we know that Neptune is smoke and mirror, but there's all of this kind of like, oh my God, like, could this be true? Or,
Right.
these reality being mirrored, but then a very sort of anticlimactic fold.
Sure, sure.
I love Jupiter in Aries. I have this year for me, when Jupiter entered Aries, I really, really liked it. And I did feel like Jupiter in Pisces was a bit of a wet blanket, kind of like, "Mwah, mwah."
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing is that Jupiter in Pisces will rule the Sagittarian season. So we're really going to get, I think, further ahead with some of the dreams or potential that was being mirrored at the beginning. And I think it does tie in, January, February, March, April, with the end of the year.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My experience of that juicy eclipse, quote
Yeah,
unquote. So, and
only on paper.
yeah, it was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bag. My mom passed away a few weeks before that eclipse, so that was a challenging part of it.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Um, but the silver lining in that eclipse for me was that we were able to purchase the home that we've lived in for like over a decade,
Yeah.
a really old house, and became homeowners for the first time, which was a dream that we've had for a long time. Now I really, I really relate to your experience of like the bubble bursting a little bit, because after the dream was achieved, the reality set in of like, oh wow, this house is very old. It needs a lot of repairs. It's a lot
Yeah.
of work maintaining a house.
Yeah.
We share this house with another tenant downstairs, so there's also the challenges that go with that relationship as well.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we may be reviewing the actual dream itself around
Yeah.
this period of time and saying, well, what actually is our new dream now that we've gotten a taste of what the living the dream is like and taking action in it?
Yeah.
Maybe we're like, well, how do we adjust our vision moving forward, right?
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think, at that time in the spring, I got COVID and it really immobilized me. So that was my whole experience of Jupiter and Pisces. I felt like really not able to pursue anything. I kind of lost faith as opposed to having faith.
Sure.
But with Jupiter and Pisces, again, with the astrology that's happening right now, it will really depend on people's personal relationship to the nodes in their chart, to Jupiter, to Saturn. I don't think all of the players will transpire in everybody's life on the same level.
Yeah.
I'm not a Jupiterian person. I have Jupiter in Virgo and I have Saturn with my sun. So, dreams and fantasy, I'll just burst your bubble right away. I'm like, my first answer is always like, no, that's not gonna work.
Yeah. So you're a fellow Jupiter Virgo?
I'm a Jupiter
Yeah.
Virgo,
Yeah, me
but
too.
I do associate with people who have strong Jupiterian
Sure.
energy as a remedial measure, because it
Right.
really helps me kind of see the potential and say yes.
Yeah.
With Jupiter, it's saying yes. But yeah, there might have been premature yes
Mm.
at the beginning of the year, where we're going to have the opportunity to revisit that and maybe sort of tie the bow.
Yeah.
I don't, yeah, I think it will be an interesting Sagittarius season because of that Mars in Gemini retrograde and then Jupiter back in Pisces. It will be an influx of mutable energy, which is again transitional,
Yeah.
flux, things in flux.
Yeah, and we've got some folks in the chat that are asking about the socio-political state of the world and some of the challenges and the conflicts that are happening around the world. And
Hmm.
does astrology see anything around that? I guess, what are your thoughts about that? How can astrology predict something like that even? What do you think?
Absolutely, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, mundane astrology is exceptional at looking at bigger trends, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at the cycles that we find ourselves in. The
Yeah.
first one, if we go the furthest, is that Saturn and Jupiter are now having their conjunction in air signs for the next 200 years.
Right.
Although one happened in the 1980s, it officially began 2020, signaling the beginning of the air period. So we're really moving from an earth period to an air period, which nobody of that is alive has experienced. So there is something very transitional about that.
Yeah.
um and
Well,
we're yeah.
and this is something I think that astrologers in our community have been talking about a lot, the conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter and what that means for our social expectations moving forward and how
Yeah.
we organize society. And I think that, um, while I hate the word the new normal, I don't, it irritates me every time I hear it. But I do think that there is a need right now to change the expectations that we have of how we organize our societies. And
100%.
and I think that what we're dealing with now is that we're in such the nascent stages of that, the
Yep.
beginning stages, that it's very disorienting.
Yep.
And I think that a lot of times people want to hang on to the old way because that's what they've known for literally a few hundred years. Like, right?
Exactly.
And I think that that's something astrology has taught me, is that our small experiences of life are, they're part of these larger cyclical movements, and what seems like it's taking a long time is just a blink of an eye as far as the universe is concerned, right? And that's why the concept of instant versus delayed gratification is actually so important, because you're not going to rush a planet, especially Saturn. You're not going to rush Saturn, and if you do, that's when you get the grand cosmic no, or running into the brick wall, so to speak. Is it's going to go on its own time. And I don't know. So maybe we're venturing off into some philosophical territory here, but I want to hear your thoughts, Elodie, as to what do you think that the Saturn Jupiter conjunction is asking of us as a community moving forward versus the previous Earth age?
Well, that's a huge question, but I do think it's good to get familiar with what air periods looked like in the past.
Hmm.
Familiarize yourself with that experience because it will help you contextualize what's happening right now.
Yeah.
In terms of air, we're talking about exchange of ideas. We're talking about horizontal networks as opposed to hierarchical structures that we've seen in the Earth era. I think now there's a democratization of language, like with astrology, how it's, everybody's speaking astrology suddenly. That's a real sort of air period phenomenon that we're seeing, like everybody's utilizing astrology as opposed to, and that's the whole other question in an astrological circle that's happening is like, how can you be an astrologer if everybody speaks astrology? It's more on its way to being a language. So with
Right.
the air, if you think about the air modality, it's a lot more about information and networking and community and exchange and concepts and ideas. That's a huge sort of shift that we're going to see. For example, how people went downtown in office building to work, and now everybody's working from home. So it
Right.
removes the need to have office building, industrial sort of neighborhoods, because and then people are going to transform that into green space or other things because there's just no more need for office building. I think that's a phenomenon of the beginning of the air period.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
the biggest one that we haven't seen in previous air period is the advent of AI. And I
Okay.
do think that's going to be a real sort of, we're already using our phone like it's an extension of ourselves. That's been sort of pushed so fast. I didn't have a cell phone in 2011, and now I'm just like constantly plugged in. It's my reminder, it's my calendar, it's my
Yeah.
everything. So AI is replacing a lot of what humans used to do. So what does that mean for us also? So I do think that's some of the air period stuff. When I looked up in the past, I got on a kick of looking at the literature that was being written in previous air period and
Yeah.
just compiling the literature that was written in air period. And it seems to be actually a period of synthesizing and taking from separate pieces as opposed to real kind of novel work emerging. It
Yeah.
seems to be like, oh, like you were saying, like, you know, people are, you go online, you put it online, it's not yours anymore. People will just grab and then construct their whole kind of thing, and then it disappears. And it's all symptomatic, I think, of the air period, and accepting a part of that, but also maybe thinking about how we can support each other and have these networks and community, and accept that it's not so individualistic anymore.
Mm. So yeah,
Is that
no,
too much?
I'm just taking it all in, and uh, I love asking the big questions to people
Yeah.
that come on, because it's sometimes my Virgo stellium can get very granular, and I love like pulling out to that bigger picture sometimes. Yes, I like that, and I my first reflection on that is seeing the release of a need to possess,
Yeah.
right? And maybe Earth being very like possessive on that level, but also that ideas are not individual ideas, they're collective ideas, and how they can uh, be shared with one another. I think that this is maybe one of the best lessons of the air age, is how do we share, right? Like, how do we learn to share?
And the longer you're going to hold on to my house, my
Right.
land, the
Yeah.
cost of food was so much better, the longer you hold on to all of these frameworks, the more it's going to be difficult to transition. It's more
Yes.
about finding solution. We know that there's inflation, we know that we're in a state of flux, we know things are changing, we're not sure about the economy, war, all of this. That's a lot part of this decade, as we know as astrologer also.
Yeah.
But the more we unite, because that's the thing, is we are part of this whole, and that's the awareness of, I think, the networking part, and how can we
Well, and that brings
connect.
me back to what was going on in the chat here, as far as there was questions about escalation of conflict in Europe potentially. And I think that what you just said speaks to seeing and maybe the old guard or an old regime thinking of it in terms of my land, my resources, my this, and how that can lead to suffering. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that this is how I see it, is that when a need for change presents itself, the suffering comes when you are trying to remain attached to the old way that is no longer vital. And that brings me full circle with this eclipse, Elodie. To me, the essence of Scorpio is, how do we release forms that are no longer providing vitality, so that we can liberate essence to find a true expression of our authenticity now, not just in what we wish it to be. Because there's a lot of themes in the Scorpio decans that talk about nostalgia as well, as far as like glamorizing something that has already started to decay.
Yeah.
And to me, that is, we're seeing that right now on a global scale. Is there are certain global players, political players, that are glamorizing an old system where they were able to oppress others for their own individual gain, right? And how do we disperse those resources in a more fair and equitable way for the survival of everyone, really? Because these individuals that have consolidated wealth really are destroying the planet in the process, correct?
Yeah, and the internet and our instant connection makes us a lot more aware of that, and the
Yeah.
disparities between rich and poor
Yeah.
also, because we're
Yes.
rubbing shoulders with all sorts of people on social media. There's no distinction when you're
Yes.
entering the Instagram realm or TikTok realm. There's no more distinction. So some people will be extremely privileged, and others not. And so I think this awareness will eventually kind of, hopefully, monopolize people, and like people are doing things, I think. And it's very complex in terms of shorter timeline. Looking at this Mars and Gemini, I think I'm more concerned about Mars entering Cancer
Sure. Sure.
in terms of escalated sort of crisis or potential things, because we know Mars in Cancer does not do very well. So in
Right.
terms of escalating conflict, I don't see the Mars retrograde period so much as that, as potentially Mars entering Cancer, Jupiter being in Aries, and then the eclipses starting happening in Aries. That's going to
Yes.
be pretty volatile.
Spicy.
Yeah. So in terms of like actually seeing.
Well, and Mars, from a lot of the traditional literature I've read, when Mars is ill dignified, it tends to act slightly less predictably, right?
Yeah.
According to some of these ancient authors. So maybe there will be a less predictable, conflict on some level. So oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to say also, in terms of other forecasting models, like for political and worldwide trend outside of the astrology, they're all saying the same thing. We're in a period of change and flux, and the faster you sort of make peace with that, the more able you'll be to navigate the experience. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that, because it doesn't look, maybe late 27, 28 will be, but there's a lot of forecasting models showing like unrest and problems.
So here's my next question for you, Elodie. How, as people who are trying to live everyday lives, how do we deal and with this type of macrocosmic change and maintain our ability to function in a healthy way?
I think you said it earlier. I think like being selective about where you put your attention, that's really, really important, because one thing with the online experience is our body doesn't make the difference between what you're just looking at versus are you living it and experiencing it. So that creates a lot of stress and tension in the body. So even what you're putting your attention on really matters, even more so now than ever. I'm really careful with images, because we're seeing so many images, and images are powerful.
Absolutely.
As anybody that practice astrological magic and image magic knows, images are very potent. And if we're exposing ourselves, and it's very compulsive, we're exposing ourselves to a lot of different truths, a lot of different reality. So yeah, I would say definitely just being extremely selective with what you want to place, what kind of image you want to place inside your temple.
Well, and also I think piggybacking off of that, words also are spells.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
And what do you want to speak into existence? And I'm not so idealistic that I think that, we can avoid every single negative thing by just, thinking positively. I think that is a slightly naive perspective. But at the same time, I do think that there is power in putting the energy, words, and images of what you would like to see, of optimism and hope. And I think that you can add to the destruction and degradation and pain and suffering by falling prey to your fear and your, I don't know. I mean,
and this is like a fine line, because people could also say you're putting your head in the sand and you're ignoring important issues.
Absolutely.
And so, but again, I do think one of the Mars power, when we speak about Mars powers, is about the ability to be single-minded and focused. So you can't save all of the animals in the meat industry while saving the people that are victim of wars, while saving yourself, while saving your neighbor, while you just that's not possible, even though we're constantly sort of plugged into all of these realms. One of the cool thing about Air Period that I've been conceptualizing is energizing the reality that I want, and not in a way that de-responsibilize me of my human role, but I also choose to be of service with my work, with what I do, with you know, and that's sort of my path. It's just I'm compelled to do that, and the choices that I make, but I don't expect myself to be doing everything on all fronts. So when you're participating with your mind, with the information, that's not necessarily changing the situation.
Sure.
So it's not putting your head in the sand.
I like that. I like the fact that we don't have to carry the torch for every single challenge. There may be something that we're called to do that is really important, that we have a certain skill set to be able to affect change in. I also like the fact that you're talking about personal responsibility as far as, and I think this comes along with acknowledging that it is a privilege to ignore someone's suffering on some level as well. And we don't want to fall into that trap of, you know, utilizing our privilege to just say, oh, everything's fine. Right. So
absolutely. No, right. And that's not what I'm saying. But I do think if matter is made of vibration, and you're constantly vibrating to the disaster and everything that is going bad in the world, that just expands. It just, like you said, it just expands. So yeah, it's a fine line between being like peace and love, like nothing bad is happening, versus, you know, acknowledging what's happening. But again, you're damaging yourself if you're exposing yourself 24/7 to the world through the internet, through the images. I think it's just you're not going to be in a position where you're grounded enough to help.
Put your oxygen mask on first, right?
Yeah,
I like that. And you know, spoken with true Libran balance. I will point out, I love that, because I really appreciate finding a balanced and tempered way to live within the world. And I do also believe that when we are experiencing chaos, calming ourselves can actually help us to make better decisions in that moment, rather than panic, right? Rather than falling prey to the overwhelm that could cause you to take an action that might be even more detrimental or add to the crisis situation. So I'm a big fan of trying to compose yourself in these times. And I think that being selective, as you've been pointing out very astutely the whole time, is a great step in that direction.
And also, I do think that the human condition, if you refer to spiritual texts and spiritual tradition, they always say the same thing. Like the human experience, we think we're reinventing the wheel or living this experience for the first time, but we've been around for a really long time, and suffering's been around for a really long time. And I do think that that's spiritual, but that's the purpose of the spiritual tradition and faith, also to kind of return us to the essential of our human experience.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, Elodie. Wow, we're going down some very interesting paths today.
Scorpio eclipse.
And I very much appreciate the power of your intellect and your very balanced approach to all of these issues. I'm a little bit envious of the time and space and silence that you have in your off-grid lifestyle, and hopefully maybe someday I'll be able to cultivate that same level of peace.
I do not have a peaceful lifestyle. I'm gonna remove that glamorous.
Do it. Remove the illusion for us. Tell us the reality of it.
Absolutely not. I mean, absolutely not. I'm contending with modern reality as everybody. I mean, I'm off grid, but off grid just means there's more things to do. I have to cut wood. I have to heat all winter. We have to heat. We don't have we can't just turn on the thermostat.
Yeah.
So we're preparing the wood and all of this. So it actually just adds a lot more to the to-do list. And I'm still functioning as a modern individual in
Sure.
society. So
Well, it's good to remove those illusions and those
absolutely.
romanticizations. I don't even know
Yeah.
how many syllables are in
It's
that word.
not peaceful. It's not peaceful. And I have
Yeah.
relationships and I have drama, like lots of it. I'm
Yeah.
Scorpio rising.
Okay. Well, then it's just the strength of your character then. It's not even just the situation. All right. So, Elodie, let's do a couple more things here and then we'll wrap for the day. Sound good?
Yep.
So, I want to just touch real quick on just a few other things. Um, I like to look at the square of the moon and then just give people a little bit of a preview of the full moon. Okay, so here we have the square. Whoops, is it squaring? What's going on? That,
Yeah. So the first quarter after the
yeah,
eclipse,
yeah, I'm trying
first
to,
quarter moon.
moon square sun. My program's doing weird things. So this should be around here somewhere, I guess.
It would be 9-degree Aquarius moon, I believe.
Yeah, I just don't know why it's not doing it. Sorry, it's just a modern technical thing. It's supposed to take me exactly to the square, but
Perfect.
here we go.
There you go.
There we go. We've got November 1st. We've got the square between the sun and the moon. How do you see this first quarter square playing out? Rudyard talks about these squares as being like a crisis of manifestation on some level. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on this Aquarius moon phase?
Well, so the time between two eclipses, as any good astrologer that know their eclipses,
Yeah.
the time between two eclipses are usually sort of seen as a liminal time. So I'm wondering about this because we're talking about the fixed angle, fixed T square. We have, the moon and Saturn signs. So all of the lesson that's been happening in the fixed signs, are going to be really exaggerated with this eclipse cycle
Fun
continuing.
for us, right? With
Well,
like
yeah,
fixed
and
risings.
when we delineate
Yeah.
things like this,
Yeah.
always I say this is not going to translate for everybody in the same
Yeah.
ways. And sometimes really surprising things come out of the pressure
Yeah.
of tension and stuff. So T squares, obviously, first quarter moon is things that are difficult to reconcile between each other because it's not just the moon squaring the sun. The
Yeah.
moon is squaring Venus, it's
Yeah.
applying to Saturn, it's going to square Uranus, it's between two eclipses. So I would say that it's a liminal time.
The Bardot period.
The
I've heard.
yeah, definitely. And although we're looking for tangible, the
Mhm.
fixed signs are looking for tangible manifestation. We know this.
Right.
Mars just stationed retrograde a day before this
Yeah.
this quarter. We're looking to actualize and manifest, and you know what they say about manifesting during eclipses.
Yeah, it is not predictable. I digress for just a second. One thing I've noticed in between eclipses is that there's a lot more like strange conspiracy theories like Bigfoot and aliens and things that come out. Have you noticed this at all? It's like Bigfoot makes an appearance like around
No,
the eclipses.
I did not notice that, but I
Yeah,
noticed like a lot of stuff with eclipses that are not
yeah.
it's things comes out of left field.
Right, right.
And that's why for me I approach eclipses as a very reverence, like a lot of
Sure.
reverence, because I do think that there's a sort of opening for a lot of things to manifest and or exit our realms. It's and not necessarily, it never necessarily plays out on eclipses or between the two eclipses. It could be much later, but the planets are expressing something, something like that, like something. Yes.
Well, and keep in mind too that these are part of larger cycles that are playing out not only in the 30-day,
Yeah.
lunar cycle, but also like 6 months for eclipse to eclipse. And then there's like I believe, 18-year cycles that they're a part, meta cycles that they're a part of as
Yeah.
well. So, um,
We're going so Mars and Gemini with this. Now we're like, this
it
cycle,
is
this
definitely be a Mars and Gemini talk.
there's no
Well, you know,
this.
you just have to surrender to it on some level, right?
How do you? I'm curious to hear
Yeah.
how you see this this first quarter between eclipses.
Yeah, so my brain has started to become entrained to the decans and
Mm-hmm.
tarot. So I'm when I look at this first quarter, I'm looking at the Five of Cups energy, that period of loss that we initiated, that ritualized grief. And then the moon is in a decan that's associated with the Five of Swords. And the Five of Swords, it shows an image of a conflict where one person was the victor and two figures are going off into exile in the background. And this decan to me speaks to a potential going into exile intentionally, potentially after maybe a disappointment. Maybe there's some kind of argument that you have where you're like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to learn to live on the fringe rather than in the center, which is represented to me by Leo and the sun. And this decan in particular relates to it is ruled by Venus. So there's this kind of energy of finding beauty on the fringes of society. Does that make sense?
Beautiful. I
So
love this. Yeah, I love the nitty gritty delineation of the Virgo. It's very insightful.
yeah, so I guess this square to me is how do when we are trying to release form that isn't serving us, how can we find beauty in our either our larger perspective, the longer term delayed gratification, and how can we find beauty in that which others have discarded as well? So, like, I'm thinking of someone who makes beautiful art from something in a junkyard, like people that have thrown something away. So, if you've lost something, how can you utilize either what remains or what someone else has discarded to create something beautiful during this period of time?
The exile component is really important, I think. Yeah, with Aquarius.
Right, with Saturn's domicile there. And I
Yeah.
think the journey with Aquarius that I've found through the study of the decans is the whole series of cards and decans speaks to it's actually kind of similar to Scorpio, although it's less about the body and it's more about idealism. So I feel like Scorpio Taurus axis is related to the recycling of forms in Scorpio, whereas the Aquarian axis with Leo is saying it's time to move on to a new set of idealistic blueprints that organize a society. Does that make sense?
Yeah, beautiful. I love that.
But it's definitely a moving on from one phase to another, which is sort of fascinating to me because we think about fixed signs as being solid and stable, but my lived experience of them is that they're transitional. It's just weird, right? Okay, and then finally, I would like to ask you just to have some very basic, quick thoughts on what this eclipse may be growing towards when we get to the full moon eclipse.
You mean this eclipse on our moon?
Oh boy, yeah,
moon?
We're gonna feel it, aren't we?
Well, I do think I like it personally. I'm a Uranian person, so again, your relationship to Uranus is going to be, awakened. But it's okay. Let's put it in a big sense. Uranus brings innovation. There's a certain restlessness to upgrade, to innovate, to do things differently that is related to our comfort zone.
Sure.
And the risk that's needed to kind of reach that next layer of comfort. The moon in Taurus does not like changing its routine. It does things a certain way. It has its own rhythm, and that rhythm cannot be disturbed. And I always say Taurus has its own time. Like Taurus time is not modern time. It's very slow.
Nature's time. It's nature's time. It's seasonal.
Yeah, and it's very felt, and that's why I was saying, like, my approach to my astrology practice is like, I'm not going to do things I don't feel like doing. So, I mean, obviously, like I do a lot of that because I have to pay bills.
Right.
But in general, my whole approach is like, I never wanted to go commercial. I didn't want to force myself to do things because
Right.
people will resonate more with my authenticity and my sort of embodied energy than me just faking my way through like the
Yes.
grind, you know? So that's the moon
Yes.
in Taurus. So in terms of that whole process with Uranus, because that's the thing is this full moon is joined with Uranus, so we can't even remove Uranus from the equation. It's a lot of restlessness for the stagnation and the need to kind of move out of stagnating patterns or stagnating modes of being. That's kind of how I see it.
Yeah. And you're not lying about liking the routine with that Taurus moon. There's nothing that disturbs my equilibrium worse than an unexpected like event happening during my day, right?
I train myself so much all the time.
Yeah,
I'm born with Uranus opposing the moon. Probably you are
I
too.
am too. Yes,
And
for
so
sure.
this balance of needing to have grounded, like really grounded embodied experience, and you know, like things take time. Like don't get at me, I'll get to it. And it's just kind of like one step in front of the other. And the Uranian thing is literally like what I was saying about martial art, is this ability to stay grounded amidst the million things that are being thrown at you, and
Right.
just returning to center.
It's a daily practice, isn't it? It's a, it's something that it's ritual, returning to center.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the
How do
other,
you see it?
yeah, I guess the other thing I can add to that, I love the fact that you're talking about the disruption of maybe crystallized routines that may have become a rut on some
Yes.
level, right?
Yeah.
So how do we get out of our ruts at this full moon? This, to me, when I look at lunations, the sun is always shining a light on something that is coming to awareness as a collective. And in that second decan of Scorpio, that's a Six of Cups kind of energy. And to me, that is an ideal, it's a nostalgic card. It's an idealization of a form that once provided us um, with support. And it's also an emerging decan where we are, Austin talks about it as distillation. So think about it as you're coming back together with somebody like a lover from the past or something, but not permanently. It is not a permanent reconciliation. It is one that is related to learning everything that you possibly can squeeze out of it, like you're squeezing and fermenting the alcohol out of grapes. And then what is left over is the wine of wisdom. But the grapes need to be discarded. Does that make sense? The wine is the experience.
I love
And
that.
so I think that we're also going to have a Mercury Cazimi very
Yeah.
shortly after that.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be some new awareness of how you merge with others emotionally, and as far as like how you're going to need to distill that experience. And then the other thing I think could happen with this, and I'm actually seeing some things in my own life that could be speaking to this, is the second decan of Taurus, where our moons are, is related to the Six of Pentacles. And in it, there is a figure that is giving out charity or alms, or is a benefactor for those that are fallen on hard times. I think there's a possibility with this that there is an unexpected benefactor that shows up potentially, or that there's, right? Exactly. Like, so I was thinking about this in context of like, I've been having some issues with student loan forgiveness. And there was some laws that were changed that disqualified me. And maybe at this eclipse, I'm requalified, and there's a benefactor that allows me to move forward from some debt. I also there's also a situation in my life where there may be an unexpected benefit from that has come from my mom's passing. There was something in regards to my grandfather, who passed actually 2 weeks after her, that there might be something involved with that. And I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe there's something in regards to that, like, so I would keep your eyes peeled for unexpected sources of benefit. And it may be materially, it may be emotionally, but That's part of what I think could be a factor with this. I'm actually much more hopeful about this eclipse than I am about the
Same.
the new moon one.
Absolutely.
I think the new moon one's going to be kind of painful a little bit.
Yeah.
I think this one could be a lot more supportive.
I feel as I have the same feeling about it.
Yeah. Because, you know, the
Mhm.
moon's exalted here. The moon's a lot happier. And even though it's being disrupted, it may be an unexpected good thing that comes out of it, right?
Yeah, and I do think it brings an into, because full moon are a culmination process. Although this is an eclipse, it pings Uranus and then it will ping Saturn. So it does bring integration in regards to what these two planets have been sort of working on for the last year and a half. You know,
Yeah.
wherever Saturn Aquarius is, Uranus, I do think there's a period of integration. In my personal life, I have issues with my neck, and
Yeah.
this scenario, Saturn squaring Moon, Uranus, has actually brought treatment for my neck. So I'm actually getting treated for my healing long time neck injury that I have.
Sure.
And I could have never ever predicted that looking at Saturn square Moon. So there is always sort of like the benefactor thing that you're talking about with the tarot card. I do think that Saturn also brings integration and rewards. Like it's just moving direct again. So weird for me to say that Saturn brings
Right.
rewards. I know.
It does,
But-
though. It
But
does.
it does in the long run.
Over
especially
time.
if you've
Over
been-
time.
Yeah, especially if you've been applying yourself to, figure out things. And I mean,
I think it rewards mature action over time, right?
yeah,
It's to me, all those solar planets, you know, Saturn, Jupiter, and whatnot, they reward action, like, and merit. But Saturn is the one that is rewarding it from like doing the hard, you know, realistic, dirty work. And
yeah.
and that's another great point about this eclipse is that, you know, Saturn is T squaring this eclipse.
But
So,
it's still,
yeah.
I don't get a bad vibe from it
Right,
either.
I don't either.
feel like, yeah, and like I said, full moon are culmination. Although Venus is now in her underworld journey, and she's ruling over this eclipse. This whole process of like getting rid of stagnating forms or patterns, and we're talking about things that are really, really lodged in,
Sure.
that are being dislodged for the benefit of your progress, Uranus.
Well, I hope and pray that I can clean out my basement. It's been super cluttered for years. That's I hope I achieve by the end of this eclipse period is a clean attic and basement that isn't full of junk anymore, which metaphorically, that can really be speaking to things that we've either repressed, you know, emotionally and our hopes for the future. If you study feng shui, like attics, a cluttered
Yeah.
attic can be involved with like hope. And I think that removing all of the unnecessary forms, it just opens up energy. I really am a
Liberates, yeah.
believer in that. Like,
Absolutely.
so, okay. Elodie, I think we got through the astrological part of this. So awesome. All right. So as we do on the channel here, we wrap up the show with an animal and an I Ching reading. And but before I get to those, I want to thank all of you that joined us today in the chat. Please, if you're listening to this, do us a favor, hit the like button, subscribe to the newsletter, support Elodie at her website, ninthhouseastrology.wordpress.
Yeah, but you can put .com. I've tested and it works.
Okay, cool. And so support Elodie in that. Check out her talk at Astromagia. And yeah, so let's tie a bow on this. Would you like to do the I Ching or the animal first? What do you think?
Animal.
Animal. Okay. This animal was really fascinating to me because this is an animal that I work with a little bit symbolically. And what I pulled for this, it's very Scorpio animal, I think.
I saw.
Yeah, I pulled the skunk, which is a new one on our channel.
Love it.
There are animals that I pull on this channel quite regularly, but this is a brand new animal that I have not talked about. So a skunk is actually a fairly peaceful animal. I think it's a pacifist by nature. They would rather just be eating tasty berries and grubs and going about their business. But one of the things that sticks out to me about the skunk is that they have a very powerful reputation, and they're able to defend themselves just by how they look. Like, and we can kind of connect this with maybe self-esteem. Like, to me, the skunk is saying, you don't need to make a big show of power. You don't need to make a big show of, like, like if someone's threatening you, what a skunk will do. Do you have skunks in Nova Scotia? Or not,
Newfoundland?
Newfoundland, sorry. Newfoundland.
No, it's an island, so there's
Yeah.
no porcupine, no
Oh,
snakes,
no.
no
Okay.
skunks.
Did you have
No.
experience with skunks in
Yes,
Montreal?
I grew
Okay.
up in Quebec. Yeah, absolutely.
So
They just say don't F with me.
yeah, right, exactly. And we have them around here in our Ypsilanti, Michigan, that we call them Ypsilanti Terriers because they're so prevalent in this
Common,
neighborhood.
okay.
So one thing you'll notice about them is when you come up on them, they will actually give you warnings. Like, they will lift their tail first. They will stomp.
I wish I could do that.
Right? They'll stomp their feet a little bit, do a little dance to be like, I'm watching you. Like, they would rather not get into a confrontation, because when they do actually spray, it takes a while for that gland to restore that pheromone or whatever it is. So it takes a lot of energy. So I would say that be very careful about spraying. Self-esteem and self-respect is really important in this. Sometimes you just have to be yourself, and just by being in integrity, that can drive away some of the people that are actually nuisances, because a lot of times people that try to take advantage of others, they're trying to find people that are vulnerable. And if you're putting out the energy that you're vulnerable, people are going to pick up on that, and they're going to be like, oh, this is a person that I can take advantage of. So if you just stay present in your integrity, you stay confident, I think that can really bring the type of people that you want. The other thing I think about skunk is it's also that smell is also attracts a mate too. So it's very scorpionic as far as the sexuality, right? I have this I used to have a tarot deck that was related to animal symbols, and you could do a spread, and I have this animal in what is called the below position, which helps keep you connected to the earth. And what it taught me was that the energy I put out there is either going to attract people that are on my wavelength, and it might repel people that aren't, picking up what I'm vibing, and that's okay. I can't, be on the wavelength with everybody, right? And I think that's another lesson of skunk, is that not everyone is going to like you all the time, and that's okay, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, if every single person likes you, you might actually not be in integrity, because it's hard to please everyone, right? If you just be yourself, you'll find the people that are, really in alignment with you. Be careful about your reputation with this animal. The skunks have a really, everyone knows a skunk when they see it. They're like, oh, there's a skunk. So I think that fits well with Mars retrograde, is in Gemini in particular, is that there's a lot of potential for conflict as far as like gossip and like using words as weapons. And you don't even necessarily have to respond to any of it. You can just like go about your business. People are going to know that you're dangerous just by how you like look on some level. And you can stamp your feet a little bit if you want. You can raise your tail, and be like, fuck off. Like, I would rather not get in a fight with you. Like,
yeah.
I'd rather just be going about my business. So themes of attraction and repelling, self-respect, the power of nonchalance. I thought that was a really interesting part of my research with skunk, is skunks, they're kind of just fun-loving animals. If you go out and walk your talk and lighten up a little bit, everything doesn't have to be so serious. And I think that's something, skunks are kind of ridiculous animals. Like, when we think of them, we laugh a little bit, right? Like, when we think of a bear, we're like, oh shit, it's a bear. Like, I don't want to mess with that. But you think of a skunk, you're like, oh, it's a skunk. Like, I don't want to. Yeah, it's cute. Exactly. So yes, and Steven's pointing out Pepe Le Pew, right? Where think of, if you come on too strong with people, that can actually repel the people that you're trying to attract as well. So it's about having a balanced energy. You don't want to leak sexual energy as well, because that can be misconstrued, and that can create all of its own problems as well.
That's very Mars, again, just conserving power for the essential.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, so that any other experiences you've had with skunks?
Well, I had skunk spraying my cats when I was young, I
Yeah,
remember, and we give them tomato juice bath, which I think doesn't
right.
work.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
but I think it's actually a perfect representation of using your martial powers properly, which is just your power, your inherent power, which is the root chakra, sexual energy, and channeling it sort of in a focused way. And what you were saying about, skunk don't want to get in a fight. I think that's actually the manifestation of a good Mars.
Yeah,
In people think, oh, you have Mars and Aries, like, ooh, bad, but most Mars and Aries people I know are non-confrontational because
sure.
they just have this sense of inner security and nonchalance. They don't feel threatened.
Mm.
While an aggressive bear, I would compare that to Mars and Cancer personally.
Yeah, yeah, I
I've
would
worked with a
agree.
lot of Mars and Cancer in
Yeah,
kitchens, and they get very flustered. So,
sure.
so yeah, I do. I think it's a great animal.
Yeah, I like that comparison with Mars and Scorpio because to me, that Mars and Scorpio is like it's defending a dying life force. It's holding on with all of its energy to preserve something. And you don't want to, you're not going to initiate a conflict if you're trying to preserve, life force, right? So,
Exactly. Yeah.
so I think that this is a great way of saying you don't need to start a fight. You just need to kind of like keep an eye out, right? And it's okay to defend yourself within reason, um, but be very careful about how you express that and how you communicate it because words can be misconstrued at this time very easily as well.
Yeah, you don't need to prove that you're powerful
There you
at
go.
everybody. Yeah.
Exactly. You don't have to prove yourself. This is good advice for us Leo people in the audience today. Leo risings. So that's kind of a challenge that we have sometimes. It's like, oh, are we being respected or not? And how can we just have that self-respect is what Skunk's talking about. Now, the hexagram was really fascinating to me. It was not what I expected. Oftentimes the hexagram is like, oh, I could see that. But this, I got number 13 with no changing lines, which translates to fellowship with people, joining with others, concord and community, keeping the group together. And there's a line that in one translation I like that says, fellowship with people, even in open fields, success. It is beneficial to cross the great river. It is beneficial for the superior person to persevere. So I'm feeling like this is like, if we're going through a period of ritualized mourning, grief, instinctual desire, it is important to lean on the people in our community on some level, right? Are you picking up the same vibe
I
from
think
this?
it's
What
the
do you think?
lesson of Saturn and Aquarius.
Yeah,
Instead of feeling like you're isolated or exiled or out of the network or community, it's kind of like about realizing your place and role and obviously this is for the Scorpio eclipse, but as we saw with the first quarter moon and Saturn and Aquarius squaring the nodal axis in these eclipses, I think it fits.
yeah, pretty interesting. There's a couple other just things that they talk about with this is finding like-minded people, finding a common purpose, supporting each other through the difficult times, nipping problems or separatism in the bud before alienation and resentment grow.
Beautiful.
I like that,
Yeah, very
right?
fitting.
Right. So try not to let a problem blow out of proportion. And to me, what I've found with this, Elodie, is that clear communication without making assumptions can really be helpful as far
Hmm.
as not letting a conflict blow up into something that is difficult to come back from. Always ask questions, right? Isn't Mars and Gemini saying, instead
Yeah.
of making assumptions, how about asking some questions and getting clarification and seeing things from multiple perspectives potentially? Okay, I think we did it. We are going a little over the 2 hour mark.
Beautiful.
This
Thank you
was
so much for
wonderful.
having me.
Yeah, this is my pleasure, and I'm so glad that you were able to join me today. I've been kind of watching from afar, and I try to choose people that have some connection with the astrology of the moment. And I'm so glad that you were able to join me today, Elodie. Thank you. And
Thank
thank you for
you.
sharing your gifts. And thank you all of you out there who joined us today and were giving some great comments in the chat. I really appreciate all of you. I hope that we're helping to create a good community for you here as well. And just as we always say on this channel, it's really important. I think kindness is something that we try to cultivate here. So in that, it includes being, it starts with being kind to yourself. So friends, I'm going to leave you today with the imploration to be kind to one another. And most of all, be kind to yourself, because I think that we can radiate that kindness from our hearts and radiate it out into the world. And be very careful, like a skunk, what energy you put out into the world, because that's how people might know you, right? And you can contribute fear to the world, or you can contribute hope. And I think that that's an important lesson around this eclipse period. So thank you again, Elodie. Find her at Ninth House Astrology and support her work. And I hope that we'll be able to talk again sometime, okay?
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. All right, friends. Take care.